He was pouring himself another glass of red wine when I caught myself watching his hands. Large, slow, deliberate movements. He didn't fumble, didn't hesitate, didn't fill the silence with awkward comments. Just refilled the glass. Set the bottle down with a quiet thud and looked at me. Not in a way that lingered, not inappropriate, but with a kind of knowing, quiet presence that unsettled me far more than it should have. My husband had excused himself to take a work call. Upstairs. He always took his work calls upstairs, even at family dinners. It was easier that way. Less noise, better reception, and no one would overhear the way he flipped from husband to project manager without pause. His father stayed behind, offered to help with the dishes. I told him no at first, out of habit, but he insisted gently, and I gave in because, truthfully, I didn't want to be alone. It was silent between us for a while. The plates were warm, slick with soapy water. I passed them to him to dry, and he folded the towel with slow precision, like someone who knew how to do things properly without asking twice. "You always move this quietly?" he asked suddenly, voice low and calm. Not teasing, not flirty, just a question. A curious, pointed question that struck deeper than it should have. I hesitated. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe I just learned not to take up too much space." He didn't. Smile or nod, he just dried another plate, held it up to the light to check for streaks, and placed it carefully on the rack. There was nothing romantic in that moment, nothing scandalous, just air. But that air felt thick, charged, like a room just before the lights flicker out, and I hated that I noticed it. My marriage on paper was fine. No major arguments, no betrayals, no hidden accounts or sudden absences. We had routines, weekend brunches, matching towels, shared calendars. But inside those clean lines, something in me had stopped breathing. I couldn't remember the last time my skin reacted to my husband's touch. Not because he was cruel or careless, just distant, polished, predictable. As if he made love like a checklist. Eye contact, check, warm up, check, 5 minutes of effort, then collapse. I never said anything. I kept folding laundry and buying groceries and accepting his compliments like folded napkins. "You look beautiful, you're amazing, I'm lucky." Always the same words, always. Delivered like lines he'd practiced in the mirror, but his father, he didn't speak like that. He didn't fill spaces with affirmation. He just occupied them, fully, presently. And that presence, as absurd as it sounded, stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. After dinner, the others left the table one by one. Some went to smoke. Others retreated to the guest room, and I stayed behind to gather the cups. He stayed too, though he didn't need to. I bent to pick up a fork that had slipped to the floor, and when I stood up, I felt him close. Just enough that I caught his scent, not cologne, something warmer, skin maybe, wool, soap. It unsettled me how quickly I recognized it again the next day. "You know," he said quietly. "He was just like this when he was younger. Never stopped moving." It was meant about his son, my husband. A small comment, tossed gently, but I latched onto it. Something about the way he said it made me feel studied, seen, and I hated how much I liked that. I tried to brush it off, changed the subject. "He always says he got it from you," I said. He laughed softly, not a full chuckle, more of a hum. I doubt that. It wasn't even flirting, that's what I kept telling myself. There was nothing in what he said, or did, that crossed any line. But I felt the shift. I felt it in my shoulders, in the way I stood. In the sharp awareness of my own body, how the thin fabric of my blouse stuck to my spine, how I hadn't changed out of my tight skirt after dinner. He didn't comment on it, didn't let his eyes wander. He just moved around me with care, with silence, with unbearable calm. When the dishes were done, he thanked me, and said he'd turn in for the night. I stayed in the kitchen long after he left, running my fingers along the edge of the marble counter. The house was quiet now upstairs. The door to my bedroom was closed. The room where my husband lay, likely already asleep with his phone buzzing beside him, probably with a muted Slack notification. I didn't want to go up. Not yet. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea. I wouldn't. Drink, stood barefoot on the cold tile, and let myself remember how close he had stood, how deliberate his hands were, how still everything had been. It was nothing, I told myself this more than once that night, but it stayed with me, in the way real things do, quietly, steadily, as if returning from far away just to remind you they exist. And when I finally climbed into bed next to my husband, I lay on my side, eyes open to the dark, and wondered not what had happened, but what might. That was the part that kept me awake. The wondering, the way my body responded to something it had no business responding to. He hadn't touched me, but something had shifted. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The morning didn't wash away the tension. If anything, it etched it deeper beneath my skin. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, wearing a faded t-shirt and soft, worn-in sweatpants that made no attempt to disguise age or time. But the way he stood there, calm, grounded, present, it did something to the room, to me. He didn't need to speak to fill a space. He just existed in it. And somehow, that was louder than words. My husband walked out of the bathroom with a towel over his shoulder, kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly, and muttered, "I need to leave earlier than planned." Then he disappeared upstairs to finish getting ready, as if this morning were like any other. As if my body hadn't spent half the night remembering a silence that said far more than anything he'd ever said to me in bed. I made coffee. I didn't want it, but it gave me something to do. Something to hold while my hands tried to ignore their own trembling. His father sat near the window, the sun casting a line of gold along the bridge of his nose. He didn't say anything, just placed his mug gently on the table next to mine, like it belonged there. Like I did too, when the front door finally clicked shut behind my husband. The house changed its shape. The walls didn't move. Nothing dramatic shifted. But everything felt quieter, fuller, charged in the way of a room just before a thunderstorm breaks. I busied myself with chores, vacuuming, sorting laundry, folding towels that didn't need folding. It was all muscle memory, motion without. Meaning he stayed outside in the garage repairing something that didn't matter. And every now and then I'd hear a soft clatter, the sound of metal against wood, and feel it resonate low in my belly like an echo. When he came back in, he didn't say much, just nodded. There was no tension, no awkwardness, only the space between us, tight and tender like skin over bone. I found it unbearable how normal we were pretending to be. I went upstairs for a shower, hoping the water would rinse away the strange heat under my skin. But it didn't. It only made me more aware. Every touch of my fingers against my body, every pass of the washcloth across my chest and thighs, stirred something deeper, something dormant. I leaned my head against the tile and inhaled slowly, trying to calm a pulse that no longer obeyed me. When I stepped out, wrapped in a towel, my hair still wet and sticking to my collarbones, I felt oddly exposed, not because I was undressed, but because my skin had memory now, and it was still buzzing. And then I saw him. I didn't expect him to be there, in the hallway, tool in hand, mid-step. We both froze. My towel slipped just slightly, revealing more of my leg than I'd meant to. I should have adjusted it. I didn't. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, he didn't look away. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just stillness, awareness, and something else. Restraint, maybe, or hunger cloaked in decency. "You're trembling," he said softly. I don't even know if he realized he said it out loud. "Maybe because you're standing too close," I replied, though my voice betrayed me. It didn't sound annoyed. It sounded like an invitation. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't step back either. The kiss wasn't premeditated. It wasn't impulsive either. It felt inevitable, like reaching for a cup that's always been there, waiting. His lips were warm, dry, gentle in a way that made my skin burn. There was no urgency, no dominance. He kissed me like a man who knew how easily something real could vanish. Slowly, with reverence, my breath caught in my chest, and for a brief second, I let myself fall into that space where there were no husbands or titles or rules, just sensation. When he pulled back, I stepped away, not because I wanted to leave, but because I didn't trust what I'd do if I stayed. Neither of us spoke, I climbed the stairs slowly, the towel damp against the back of my knees, my body still humming with confusion and heat. Inside the bathroom, I leaned against the door, eyes closed, heart pounding in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. He hadn't touched me inappropriately, he hadn't said anything wrong, but something in me had changed, something had opened, something that wanted, something that knew, and more than anything, I realized I would want it again. The third morning came with an unexpected stillness, not the pleasant kind that follows. A good night's rest, but the kind that wraps around your body like a sheet left in the freezer, cold, thin, and impossible to ignore. I stood at the kitchen counter, slicing strawberries for no one in particular, the blade making soft, damp sounds against the wooden board. My husband sat nearby, barely awake, sipping coffee as if it were medicine, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. I watched him for a moment longer than I should have. There was nothing inherently wrong with him. He was clean, punctual, polite. But he was fading into the wallpaper of my life, present, yes, but colorless, like a habit I never questioned. He looked up briefly and asked if I wanted to come with him on a short trip out of town. A weekend getaway, some vague mention of a cabin, time alone, disconnecting. It should have made me feel something. Gratitude, maybe, hope. But instead, I felt the familiar twinge of resistance in my chest, as if my body already knew the answer before my mouth had time to lie. I think I'll stay, I said after a pause too long to pass unnoticed. There's so much to catch up on here, I haven't even organized the boxes in the storage room. He didn't press, he rarely did. By noon, his suitcase was packed. He kissed my cheek without really looking, and I forced myself not to flinch. There was no anger in me, no bitterness, just the acute awareness that even his touch had become obligatory, predictable. The way people hug relatives at funerals, out of habit, out of duty. After he left, the air in the house shifted once again. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of shift you feel in your spine before a storm. I walked slowly through the rooms, unsure of what I was looking for. Maybe space, maybe silence, or maybe just a reason not to feel what I was feeling. He appeared around 3 in the afternoon. I didn't expect him to knock before coming into the house. This was his son's home after all. But the knock came anyway. 3 soft, deliberate taps. As if he were asking not for entry, but for permission to be seen again. I opened the door without a word. He stood there in a navy jacket, the collar slightly turned up, hair windswept, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of apples. "And cinnamon, I brought something," he said, offering the bag without ceremony. I took it. The warmth seeped through the paper and into my palms, a ridiculous detail, but my body remembered the warmth longer than it remembered the taste of anything inside. He didn't stay in the kitchen. He walked into the living room as if he'd done it 100 times, sat in the armchair by the window, and rested his hands on his knees. I followed a few minutes later, the bag unopened in my hands. We didn't talk for a while, just existed in the same space, the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but layered, complex, saturated. It was he who finally broke it, his voice softer than I expected. "Did you mean to stay behind?" I didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," I said. There was no judgment in his face, no assumption, just a subtle shift in his posture, as if he'd been holding something heavy in his chest and had just now set it down. "You didn't have to," he said, almost more to himself than to me. I watched the way his fingers folded and unfolded in his lap. Strong, capable hands, the kind of hands that did things deliberately. Unlike my husband's, which had grown used to swiping screens and tapping keys. There was something grounding about the way this man sat, as if gravity respected him more than others. I thought of the kiss again, not its taste, or even the act, but the way my body had leaned into it before my mind even agreed. It scared me. How little resistance I had. How much I'd wanted it. He stood up at some point and walked to the window. I followed his movement, watched how the light hit the curve of his neck. There was nothing overtly seductive in his stance. Nothing aggressive. But everything about his presence made my body lean forward. Without permission, we talked a little, eventually, about meaningless things, weather, furniture, the noisy neighbors. But even in those words, something hung underneath. A hum, a current, the unsaid getting louder with every sentence, as the I. Afternoon folded into early evening. He stood and said he should get going. I walked him to the door, the bag of untouched pastries still sitting on the counter like a forgotten gift. We paused in the doorway, not touching, not speaking, and then he said, "You don't have to explain anything." It wasn't a statement meant to comfort me, it was a mirror, reflecting everything I had tried not to think. I nodded, lips pressed, together, throat dry. When he left, I didn't move for a long time. I stood by the door, staring at the quiet street, my hand resting on the frame as if it could hold me steady. Upstairs, the bed was freshly made. The sheets smelled like lavender and detergent. I sat on the edge of it, my fingers trailing along the seam of the pillowcase. My body wasn't quiet. It was loud, restless. It remembered everything, the warmth of his breath, the closeness of his voice, the restraint in his hands. I didn't cry, I didn't pace, I just sat there, still in my blouse and jeans, and realized something that terrified me. I wasn't waiting for guilt. I was waiting for him to come back. I didn't see him the next morning, and perhaps that should have felt like a reprieve, a break in the spiral. But instead it left a quiet ringing in my chest, a kind of hollow tension that I carried with me through every room of the house. I moved slowly, methodically, doing chores that didn't need doing. I folded sheets that had already been folded, reorganized the pantry, took a toothbrush to the tile grout in the downstairs bathroom. Anything to silence the sensation of waiting. But the silence didn't help. It only amplified the pressure building beneath my ribs. Around noon, I opened the hallway closet to look for a tablecloth and noticed something tucked against the back wall, an old paper bag I didn't recognize. Folded neatly with no dust, I took it out without thinking, only to realize with a slow tightening in my chest that inside was a box, thin, rectangular, wrapped with unfamiliar care. No ribbon, no card, just a note, scribbled on a scrap of paper and tucked beneath the lid. If it doesn't fit, throw it away. That was it. For a full minute, I didn't open it. I held it in my hands, letting the weight of it settle into my body, and something sharp and breathless stirred at the base of my spine. I wasn't even sure why it scared me. When I finally lifted the lid, I found a set of lingerie inside. Nothing garish, nothing cheap, just one piece. Soft ivory, seamless, delicate. The kind of fabric that didn't demand attention but rewarded it. It was absurdly simple. No lace. No bows, just elegance. And it was mine, in the exact size I wore. He hadn't asked, hadn't guessed. He had known. I carried it upstairs like contraband, my heart pounding louder than the sound of my own steps. The bedroom was filled with afternoon light when I closed the door behind me, the floor warm beneath my feet, and the mirror standing tall against the opposite wall like a silent witness. I didn't try it on right away. I stood there staring at it, folded across my hands, wondering what it meant that I wanted it so badly. Not the gift itself, but the feeling it gave me. A feeling I hadn't felt in years, that I was seen, desired, not as a wife, not as someone's daughter-in-law, but as a woman, one with a body, one with nerve endings and longing and skin that remembered what it was like to be hungry for something she couldn't name. I peeled off my clothes slowly, not out of seduction but reverence. My fingers brushed my hip bones, my ribs. I looked at my body as if I were seeing it for the first time, the slight marks of age, the softness in places once taut, the faint shadows along my collarbone. And somehow in that moment, none of it felt like failure. It felt like truth. I put the piece on carefully. It hugged me in ways nothing else ever had. Not too tight, not revealing, just there, like a second skin that whispered instead of screamed. And then I looked at myself in the mirror. It was not about beauty. It wasn't even about sex. It was about presence, ownership, about seeing myself and knowing that I still had the power to want, that I wasn't invisible, that I hadn't faded completely into the life I'd built. I stood like that for what must have been 10-15 minutes. The sunlight shifted behind me, making slow tracks across the wall. And in the silence, I could almost hear the echo of his voice. Not in words, but in the way he looked at me. The next few hours passed in a strange, almost dreamlike state. I didn't change back into my clothes. I layered a robe over the lingerie, loose and soft, and went about the house like that. I made tea. I stood barefoot on the porch. I answered a spam call and hung up before a word was spoken. And then, just past 5 o'clock, I heard the knock again. It wasn't a surprise. Not really. I opened the door slowly, the fabric of my robe barely brushing my knees. He stood there with a bag of groceries in hand, no smile on his face, just that same quiet steadiness that had started to undo me days ago. "I thought I'd cook," he said. "If that's all right." I nodded, stepped aside. We didn't speak much as he unpacked the bag in the kitchen, vegetables, herbs, a small bottle of wine. He moved efficiently, like he'd done this 1,000 times in another life. I leaned against the doorway, watching his hands, remembering the way they felt even though they'd barely touched me. At some point, he glanced over his shoulder. His eyes fell on the edge of my robe, the bare skin of my thigh just visible beneath it. He didn't stare, didn't leer, just met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and something passed between us like static. "You're wearing it," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't respond. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. We sat down to eat once everything was ready. The food was simple: roasted vegetables, warm bread, olives, and cheese. We drank 1 glass of wine each, nothing more. And still, I felt drunk, not from the alcohol but from the space, the tension, the restraint. When he stood to clear the plates, I reached out, instinctively, almost unconsciously, and touched his wrist. He paused, looked down at my fingers on his skin, and I felt the rush return. The one from the hallway, the one from the kiss. But I didn't pull away this time. Neither did he. The moment held, long enough for me to understand, completely and without denial, that this wasn't confusion. It wasn't fantasy. I wanted him, not just in the vague, forbidden way women sometimes imagine strangers, but in the way a starving person wants food, the way a drowning person wants air. It didn't matter that it was wrong. It didn't matter that I had a husband, or that he had a son. What mattered was that, for the first time in years, I felt like a woman again. And I knew, with complete clarity, that I wasn't done wanting. I didn't sleep that night, not in the way that mattered. My body lay still beneath the sheets, but my mind replayed every moment of the evening with obsessive clarity. The scent of the roasted garlic clinging to the air, the texture of his wrist under my fingers, the quiet way he had looked at me when I didn't let go. There had been no touch beyond that, no kiss. But the restraint between us had grown so thick it felt almost physical, like a hand pressing gently against my chest from the inside. When the sun began to bleed into the room, I got up without thinking. I moved through the motions of a normal morning, brushing my hair, washing my face, tying the robe tighter around my waist. But none of it felt real. My hands trembled slightly when I reached for a mug. The coffee tasted bitter no matter how much sugar I added. By the time the afternoon rolled in, I knew he would come again. I didn't tell myself it was a guess. It was a certainty. Something unspoken had shifted between us last night. Not with words, but with that held moment at the dinner table, with the way I had left my hand on his skin longer than I should have, and the way he had stayed perfectly still beneath it, letting the contact speak in place of both of us, so I prepared. Not explicitly, not in a way that could be called seduction, but I chose everything deliberately. I laid out the same lingerie, smoothed it carefully across my body, let the straps find the natural slope of my hips and shoulders. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in years, soft dark blue, hugging enough to feel like skin, modest enough to feign coincidence. No perfume, just lotion, clean, bare skin. I wanted to feel everything. I didn't sit waiting. I didn't light candles or rehearse lines in my head. I went about the house like it was any other day, vacuuming the stairs, watering the plants. But my ears listened differently. Every sound became potential. Every breath held just a bit too long. He knocked at 4:30, 2 soft raps this time, not 3. I opened the door slowly, already knowing it would be him. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at me. gaze lowering briefly to take me in, then returning to my eyes. "I left something in the garage yesterday," he said, and held up a set of keys like a prop. It was a lie, but it was kind. A soft kind of lie meant to protect whatever this was from. The cruelty of reality. I stepped aside, let him in. We didn't touch. We didn't say anything else for several minutes. He made his way toward the garage, but stopped in the hallway as though he'd forgotten why he was walking. I stood near the kitchen counter, running my fingers along the rim of my glass, watching the light catch the surface. And then, something in the room cracked. Not loudly, not even visibly, but something invisible between us gave way. Like a thread pulled too tightly for too long, he turned. I didn't move, neither did he. But everything inside me surged forward as if my body had made the decision before my brain could even vote. He took a step, just one, and then another. I let the glass go. It clinked gently against the counter, not breaking, just marking the moment. When we stood face to face, the silence wasn't empty. It was thick, reverent, full of things we'd chosen not to say. He didn't reach for me. I reached for him. A slow hand, fingers curling around the back of his neck, my thumb brushing the side of his face where the stubble grew uneven. His breath caught, and I kissed him. Not gently, not cautiously. This kiss wasn't like the first. It wasn't hesitant, soft, observational. It was deliberate. It came from the base of the spine, from a part of me that hadn't spoken in years. His lips met mine with hunger, but not the kind born from lust. This was deeper. He kissed like a man who'd already imagined this 100 times and wanted to memorize it for the 101st. My back hit the wall softly, the movement unplanned. His hands stayed respectful, low on my waist, not exploring, not greedy, but my skin burned under them all the same. I felt my breath hitch, my chest rise against him, and somewhere in the eye, distance. I heard the quiet thud of my heart choosing sides. He pulled away before I did. His eyes scanned mine, checking for something. I don't know what. Regret, maybe. Fear. But I didn't flinch. He rested his forehead against mine for a long second. We breathed together, inhale, pause, exhale, like a language we both knew but hadn't used in years. And then he stepped back. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing that needed translating. Not in that moment. He left through the back door, silent as always. I didn't follow. Instead, I leaned against the same wall, my palms pressed flat to the surface like I was trying to anchor myself to the earth. My body trembled, not from guilt, not even from the kiss, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened, of what couldn't be undone. That night, I didn't cook, I didn't call my husband, I didn't reply to messages or pretend to care about errands left unfinished. I just sat alone in the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tile, the taste of him still on my lips. There was no plan, no next move, only want, and the terrifying knowledge that I was no longer trying to resist it. The days that followed were quiet, not because nothing happened, but because what had already happened was enough to shift the ground under my feet. I moved through each hour with an awareness I couldn't turn off, every touch of fabric against my skin, every pause between thoughts. Every time the wind pressed through an open window, it all felt amplified, like the world had thickened somehow. Nothing had changed on the surface, but beneath everything was different. He didn't come the next day, and I didn't reach out. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew we'd both already crossed the threshold of something irreversible. There was no need to chase what was now inevitable. My husband called from the cabin late that evening. He asked how things were at home. I told him the truth, about the house, the weather, the groceries. I didn't lie. I just omitted everything. That mattered. I didn't say that I had kissed his father in our hallway, that I had stood with my eyes closed for 5 full minutes after, feeling the imprint of his body still pressed against mine, that I had traced the edge of my lips with my finger hours later, hoping the sensation hadn't faded completely. I told myself this wasn't a betrayal in the traditional sense. There had been no deception, no manipulation, no plan, just a pull, strong, undeniable, and now growing harder to pretend wasn't real. On the 3rd evening, I heard his voice again, not in person, but in my memory, filling the empty space of the kitchen like music I hadn't realized I'd missed. I leaned against the sink, closed my eyes, and let the silence answer. There was no instruction, no decision, just presence, the absence of denial. The knock came. The following morning, I was in the backyard, pruning the lavender bushes along the fence, when I heard it, not the sharp kind of knock meant to announce someone, but the softer rhythm of someone already familiar with the house, someone asking permission, not demanding entry. I didn't wipe the dirt from my hands. I didn't fix my hair. I just opened the door. He stood there in a light blue shirt rolled to the elbows, a paper bag in one hand, his posture relaxed but focused. We didn't smile. There was no need for that now. I thought I'd cook again, he said simply. I stepped back to let him in. This time the house didn't resist him. The floorboards didn't creak under his steps. The windows didn't rattle with wind. Everything in the space seemed to accommodate him, like he'd already belonged here, long before either of us realized it. While he unpacked groceries, I washed my hands and leaned against the counter, watching him move. His hands were steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his breath easy. He didn't perform. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk or charm. He just occupied the space in a way that made it feel warmer, grounded. He was cutting zucchini when I said, without looking at him, "Why haven't you kissed me again?" He didn't stop slicing. He finished the piece, set the knife down, and wiped his hands slowly before turning to face me. "Because I wanted you to wonder," he said. "I wanted you to feel it before I gave it to you again." His words weren't cruel. They were honest. And something about that made my stomach tighten. Not in discomfort, but anticipation. After dinner, we didn't linger at the table. He carried the plates to the sink, rinsed them with care, and left them to dry. I stood nearby, watching the way the light from the ceiling haloed the side of his face, catching the silver at his temples. When he finished, he turned to me, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the kind of calm that makes the air around you still. "If I ask you to come with me," he said, "just to sit in my house, would you come?" I didn't speak. I just nodded. We left the house without a word to the empty rooms behind us. No bag, no excuse, no explanation. The car ride was silent, but not uncomfortable. I watched the way he drove, focused, smooth, one hand resting on the wheel like it belonged there. The road was familiar, but it felt new under the weight of what we were becoming. His house was smaller than ours, older. It smelled of cedar and books. The windows were slightly fogged with the sudden change in temperature, and a quiet warmth pulsed from the old radiator in the hallway. He didn't guide me anywhere. He just opened the door, took off his shoes, and disappeared into another room. I followed him not because I was told, but because I wanted to. The hallway was narrow, the floor soft beneath my feet, and when I reached the room at the end, he was there, seated on the edge of an old chair, a glass of water in his hand, as though this were a normal evening and not the continuation of something unspeakable. I sat across from him, our knees not quite touching. "I didn't bring you here to take anything from you," he said. "I just wanted to be in the same room without pretending." I believed him, and maybe that was more dangerous than if he'd tried to seduce me, because nothing in his voice felt calculated. Nothing about this was casual. We sat in silence for what must have been an hour. I listened to the creak of the radiator, the soft hum of the city outside, the beating of my own pulse in my wrist. When I finally stood, he stood too. We didn't say goodbye, we didn't hug, but he walked me to the door, and as I stepped outside, he said just one thing. "You still have the lingerie?" I turned. "Do. Wear it again. Next time." There was no flirtation in his tone. Just knowing, just truth. And I knew then. There would be a next time, because neither of us was pretending anymore. The next time came sooner than I expected, though I wasn't counting hours anymore. Time had started to bend around the silence we shared, curving and folding like sheets still warm from another body. The days between were no longer filled with routine, but with a quiet tension. Alive, waiting, thick like breath against glass. I thought of him constantly, but not in the way women daydream about infatuations or the chaos of forbidden romance. This wasn't fantasy. It was too rooted. In the real, the way he moved through space, the steady cadence of his voice, the gravity in his silences. I remembered how he said nothing the night he brought me to his home, and how that stillness spoke more than any touch. It wasn't just restraint. It was intimacy, at its most raw. The kind that makes you tremble because there's nowhere to hide in it. And now, I was preparing again. This time, there was no hesitation, no debate over what it meant to choose the lace over the cotton, the red over the beige. I chose what I knew would remind me who I was beneath all the roles I had been playing: wife, daughter-in-law, hostess. The lingerie was darker this time, silk against skin, no frills, no softness, just clarity. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening each piece like armor, not to protect myself, but to feel everything with precision. Dress I chose slid over my shoulders like a secret I was no longer trying to hide. Navy again, but tighter, colder, sharper. The kind of fabric that whispered when I moved. I left my hair undone, wild in the way it naturally fell, and skipped perfume, letting the clean scent of my skin carry its own message. He knocked at twilight. It wasn't casual. It wasn't planned. But it was timed to something unspeakable, like our bodies were following the same unwritten map. I opened the door before he could knock again. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, and his eyes rested on the place where the silk met the hollow of my throat. That was all it took. No words, no invitation, just a glance that saw through everything. We left my house without speaking. This time, we didn't go to his place. He drove out of town, past the familiar turns, past the fading suburbs, until the road narrowed and the houses grew farther apart. Trees closed in on either side, and the horizon turned that golden shade of near evening, where the sky holds its breath before giving into the dark. Eventually, we pulled into a small lot, gravel, uneven, surrounded by tall grass and nothing else. There was an old trailhead sign, weathered from sun and time, and a path leading through trees I didn't recognize. He stepped out of the car, walked to my side, and opened the door. Still no words, still no need. We walked. The trail was quiet, earthy beneath our feet. Birdsong somewhere above, leaves rustling in the kind of breeze that moves like memory. Soft, forgotten, intimate. After about 15 minutes, the trees opened, revealing a small clearing with a bench, aged, splintered, but strong. No houses nearby, no signs, just the hush of nature, like the world had stepped back to let us breathe. He sat first. I joined him, knees angled toward his, our shoulders almost brushing. "I used to come here when I needed to feel like myself again," he said. Before life got loud, I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because I understood now. The pull toward quiet, toward something unspoiled. We sat like that for a long time, watching the sky dim, the colors bleeding slowly into one another. There was no tension, but there was charge, heavy in the air, laced through every breath. I felt it in my thighs, in the back of my neck, in the way I couldn't quite keep my hands still. And then he turned to me. His hand came to my jaw. Slow, steady, with a care that bordered on reverence. His thumb brushed just below my ear, and my eyes fluttered closed. Not because I was bracing for something, but because I was letting go. The kiss came again, this time outdoors, beneath an open sky. It was neither rushed nor tentative. It was certain. It was an answer. His other hand rested at my hip, fingers spread wide, and I leaned into him, not like a woman looking for escape, but like someone walking toward fire with full awareness of the burn. We broke apart only when breath became necessary. His forehead rested against mine again, like before, and for a long second, I thought I might say something reckless, something permanent, but instead, I pressed my lips together and breathed him in. The air around us was turning cooler now, the light slipping. He took my hand without asking, laced his fingers through mine, and we sat there like that, silent, entwined, unhidden. I didn't think of my husband once, not out of malice, but because, in that moment, he didn't exist. Not here, not in this clearing where the wind carried only truth. By the time we returned to the car, night had fully arrived. He opened the door for me again, and when I slid into the seat, I felt the press of the silk against my skin, still warm from his hand. Every nerve was alive. We didn't speak on the drive back, but the silence was no. Longer waiting, it was becoming. The night after the clearing settled over me like the echo of a thunderstorm. Still, but charged. My skin felt marked, even if there were no bruises or fingerprints. Everything between us had been careful, deliberate, yet I carried it in my body like a bruise beneath the ribs, a tenderness that pulsed not with shame, but with clarity. The next morning, I moved through the house with a strange sense of detachment. The floor under my feet didn't feel like mine. The walls, once so familiar, now observed me like strangers. I noticed things I had ignored for years: the scuffed paint near the baseboards, the uneven hum of the fridge, the way sunlight filtered differently through the blinds depending on the hour. It was as if my senses had been reset. Or worse, sharpened. I wasn't just existing in the space anymore. I was aware of it. Every surface, every sound, every absence, especially his. He didn't come that day. I told myself I was grateful for the pause, that I needed room to think, to breathe, to reclaim something of myself from the chaos of want. But the truth pressed hard against that illusion. I missed him. Not just his presence, but the way he made the air shift. The way I felt seen in a way that frightened and soothed me all at once. By early afternoon, I opened the drawer in the hallway I hadn't touched in months. Inside were letters, receipts, warranties for appliances I no longer remembered buying, and at the bottom, tucked into a folded napkin from our wedding dinner, was a photo, me and my husband, smiling, lips wine dark, eyes bright. We looked happy, younger, yes, but more than that, uncomplicated. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reach through the image to feel what I had felt in that moment. But it was gone, not poisoned, not ruined, just faded, like a scent that once made your chest ache but now barely tickled the memory. I set the photo face down. Later that evening, I received a message from my husband, a photo of the cabin. The lake behind it was glass. Still, the sky dusky pink. His caption read, "You'd love this light." I didn't reply. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. The guilt came in soft waves, never all at once. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't confess to the walls or whisper apologies into my pillow. Instead, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, slowly unbuttoning my shirt. My bra strap had left a faint red mark along my shoulder. I traced it with my fingertip. It vanished within seconds. That's the thing about desire. It leaves marks. You can't explain but always feel. At 7:42 p.m., the bell rang. Not a knock, not a text, just the low, deliberate hum of the doorbell. I didn't check who it was. I already knew. He stood there with no expression, just a shift in his shoulders that told me something was different tonight. He didn't bring food. He didn't ask to come in. He just looked at me and said quietly, "We need to talk." I stepped back to let him in. We sat across from each other at the table, but there was no meal between us this time. No wine, no pretense. "I didn't expect this," he began. "Not from you, not from myself." I didn't respond. I let him say what he needed. "I thought I could keep this." Contained, quiet. "But I think about you constantly. When I wake up, when I try to sleep, even when I see him." That last word sat between us like glass. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "This isn't a mistake," he said, "but it is a choice. And you need to know, I want you. Not just here, in passing. I want you in rooms with morning light. I want you in the spaces no one sees, but only if you want that too." I looked at him, past the words into the man who had stood beside me as a relative, a guest, a stranger, and now something entirely else. "I don't know what I want," I said. "Only that I can't stop needing this." That was the first honest thing I'd said aloud in weeks. He nodded. "Then we start there." And just like that, the tension broke. Not with movement, not with touch, but with truth. The kind of truth that doesn't bring peace, but clarity. The kind that doesn't solve anything but finally gives the wound a name. We didn't kiss that night. We sat in the quiet, the air heavy with possibility, and I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about becoming someone I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. Someone who wanted without apology, someone who chose her hunger over her history. The end didn't come with a crash. It never does. Not in the stories that matter. It arrived. Quietly, like the final page of a book you didn't realize you were finishing. The house didn't change. The furniture stayed in its place. The morning light still cut through the blinds in its usual way, brushing across the wooden floor in long golden lines. But something fundamental had shifted in the walls, in the air, in me. My husband returned from the cabin late on a Sunday evening. He was tan, relaxed, carrying a bag of firewood that still smelled of pine and ash. He kissed me on the cheek, let his fingers rest too briefly on my hip, and asked if I'd missed him. I smiled, I said the words I was supposed to say, and then I made dinner. We talked about ordinary things, fuel prices, the neighbor's dog, how the lake had been unusually quiet this year. I nodded in the right places, laughed once, maybe twice, but inside, something was pulling taut, not breaking, just tightening. To the point of silence, he didn't know. Of course he didn't. He hadn't changed. He was still the same man I had married, steady, predictable, kind in the way that didn't require effort. A man you could build a life with, but not necessarily a self, and that was the part I hadn't admitted to myself until now. He saw the life we shared. I had begun to see the life I had lost within it. I didn't contact his father the next day. I didn't need to. He didn't come either. I think we both understood that whatever existed between us no longer needed validation. Through presence, it had already left its mark, not just on the skin, but deeper, woven into how I saw the world, how I heard my own voice, how I felt the floor beneath my feet. And yet, I couldn't let it go without resolution. It was raining when I walked to his house 3 days later. Not heavily, just enough to make the pavement dark and reflective. I didn't take an umbrella. I didn't rush. My coat was thin, and the water soaked through the sleeves. But I welcomed the cold. It cleared my head. When he opened the door, he didn't look surprised. He stepped aside. I entered in silence. The warmth of his hallway felt dissonant against the wetness clinging to me. He reached for a towel, handed it to me without a word. I dried my hands slowly, then met his gaze. "I came to say goodbye," I said. He looked at me, really looked. His face held no bitterness, no anger, just a knowing. "I figured," he said. But I didn't want it to end with silence. I nodded. The towel hung limp in my hands. "I don't regret it," I whispered. "Neither do I," he said. We sat across from each other like we had that first time, on opposite sides of a worn table. Only this time, the distance was measured not in inches but in finality, the kind that doesn't beg or plead but accepts. "I needed you to wake something in me," I said. "And you did. But I can't keep building on something that has no place to live." His breath caught, but he didn't speak. He simply looked down at his hands. Those same hands that had touched me without needing to take anything. That had held space more than they'd ever held flesh. When I stood to leave, he rose with me. I reached for the door but paused. Then, impulsively, I turned back and kissed him. Not like before, not with hunger, but with reverence. A closing of a circle. His lips were still warm, still familiar, but I didn't belong there anymore. "I'll think of you," I said. He smiled, soft and sad. "I hope you do." I left without looking back. That night, I lay beside my husband, his arm draped lazily across my waist, his breath steady. The house hummed its old song. And I thought of the clearing, of the sky, the bench, the silence that had once made my pulse race. But I didn't feel grief, only gratitude, not for the man I'd betrayed, or the one who had shown me how, but for myself, for remembering that I was still alive under the quiet, still wanting, still capable of more than I had allowed myself to feel for years. The affair was over, but I was not. And in that final moment, Beneath sheets that once made me feel invisible, I finally understood. I had been starving, and now I had tasted something I would never forget.